South Africa, igama lami ndinguSiviwe Gwarube, the DA's National Spokesperson. Welcome to the Inside Track. This is our first episode for 2021, and what a year it has been. The story on everybody's lips is, when will South Africa go back to normal? Or will we be stuck in this perpetual state of COVID-19 waves and lockdowns for years to come? We know that the only solution to breaking this deadlock is achieving herd immunity in South Africa through the introduction of a vaccine. Until that happens, the cycle will simply continue. But do we have any hope of seeing a vaccine in South Africa at all this year? Is it safe? Can we afford it? Stay tuned for answers to all of this and more. Please like this video and share with your friends and family, and please subscribe to our page and our channel. First up, we take a look back at the week in headlines.
The 2021 school year has now been delayed by 2 weeks instead of returning to school on the 27th of January.
Eskom's forecast for power cuts show that for the months ahead, South Africans will find themselves in the dark.
South African liquor traders say the industry cannot survive another ban on alcohol sales, and they're pleading with government to lift the current restriction on the 15th of January.
South African Breweries has confirmed it's pulling investments worth another 2.5 billion rand from the country. This follows government's third alcohol sales ban in the wake of another COVID-19 surge.
Break the rules and end up in jail. It's as simple as that, according to the police minister, Becky Cele.
Non-compliance will be dealt with very harshly.
Cele has said SANDF soldiers will be brought in to patrol the beaches to keep people away.
So they must get out of there.
Today we established an interministerial committee which will be chaired by the Deputy President.
A story now with far-reaching consequences for those who are involved with SASSA. They've suspended over 200,000 temporary disability grants. It's all due to a lack of money, we understand. The suspension resulting in dire backlogs and beneficiaries also having to even reapply for medical assessments. How is that going to work in a year of COVID?
This week in the headlines, President Ramaphosa drops the ball yet again. The education of our children hangs in the balance as school reopening is delayed. Another crisis at SASSA leaves millions of vulnerable South Africans in the lurch. And believe it or not, South Africa is in the dark in more ways than one as crippling blackouts hit. But first, in a spectacular turn of events, the president has made a deal with the devil yesterday when he appointed Deputy President David Mabuza as the head of the Interministerial Committee to oversee the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. The president made this announcement during an ANC meeting, not even in a normal government communication channel. This is a man, David Mabuza, who destroyed Mpumalanga when he was the premier. He wrecked Eskom, leaving the country in the dark, and has been completely absent throughout this entire crisis. Mabuza may have been socially distancing in Russia this whole time, for all we know. A breaking story yesterday revealed evidence of medical schemes allegedly racially profiling medical professionals and rejecting their legitimate claims for patient treatment on the basis of their race. If these allegations are proven true, these medical schemes would be in dire contravention of the Constitution. And the Council for Medical Schemes, which is their regulator, must urgently further this investigation and take the harshest action against any medical schemes found guilty of this crime. Next, on to the deferred education of our children. 2020 has been a harrowing year for South African learners who had to complete school under very difficult circumstances. The official date for reopening of schools was next week, Monday, the 27th of January, but now it's been pushed out to mid-February. Every single day that children are out of school deepens the education crisis in our country, and it further entrenches inequality as those who don't have access to online learning opportunities continue to be locked out of that opportunity. Also, those people remain vulnerable as they sit at home and sometimes miss out on the one nutritional meal that they have on that day. Of course, the health and the safety of learners and teachers and their parents is of paramount importance, and no school should be able to open if it isn't safe to do so. But this should be balanced with the need to educate our children and their well-being. Next, on to the ongoing Zondo Commission. Never before has somebody so desperately seeking his day in court pulled out every single trick in the book to avoid his day in court. But that's how Jacob Zuma, the nation's Dodger-in-Chief. And speaking about delays, what is happening at SASSA? In the midst of a second wave of COVID-19 infections, the government forced thousands of desperate and vulnerable grant beneficiaries to queue for hours at SASSA offices to reapply in person for their disability grants. Persons with disabilities and the elderly have now been condemned to sleeping on the streets and waiting in line for hours in the scorching heat. The DA repeatedly urged Minister Zulu to accept accountability for this crisis, following which she visited the SASSA offices in Bellville on Friday last week, where people had been queuing for days. But Minister Zulu chose to conduct her oversight visit from inside an armoured police vehicle. What is she so afraid of? Why can she not face the very people that she condemned to that kind of indignity for days? And if that's not enough, the police arrived with water cannons turning onto vulnerable people who had been standing in queue for days. Shame on you, Winde Zulu. Government had more than enough time to ensure that officers were ready to safely assist those who had to reapply for their grants, but would do so with dignity. On to Begitsele and his obsession with hunting down surfers instead of allocating the same resources and the same energy to fighting real crime. On top of this, we have learnt that it is costing us 95 million rand a month to deploy the army to enforce irrational lockdown regulations. This is money that should have been spent protecting you from gangs, from farm attacks to gender-based violence. It's time for this sheriff to get his priorities straight. And it was yet another dark week in South Africa as rolling blackouts hit again. I don't know if you remember, in 2015, President Cyril Ramaphosa said, and I quote, "In another 18 months to 2 years, you will forget the challenges that we had with relation to power and energy and Eskom ever happened." Well, President Ramaphosa, it is now exactly 5 years, 4 months, and 18 days later. And guess what? South Africa still finds itself in the dark. Can you believe that 2021 is the 15-year anniversary of load shedding in South Africa? 15 years. That is a decade and a half. What is, however, especially worrying about these latest blackouts is the huge impact they have on hospitals where people are fighting for their lives on ventilators, as well as the repercussions it could have for the cold storage needed for vaccines when they eventually arrive on our shores. It's time to bring independent power producers online, diversify our energy sector, and keep the lights on once and for all. It is not that difficult. The solutions are there. And if you thought you could drown your sorrows of load shedding, the recent announcement of the adjusted level 3 lockdown by Dr. Dlamini Zuma indicates that we are nowhere near the recommencement of the sale of alcohol. But the alcohol ban is not just about you and I having a pint at the end of the day. It's about jobs, permanent and seasonal. We've already lost an estimated 165,000 jobs in this industry. 165,000 jobs which support countless households. Not to mention the fact that this industry brings in 2.5 billion per month in tax revenue, which is now being lost. We need to reopen our economy responsibly so that we can save both lives and livelihoods. Now, moving on to our spotlight this week. As the nation kicked off the year with an extended lockdown, all eyes turned on the COVID-19 vaccine. When will it get here? Will it ever get here? Let's take a look at this story in the spotlight.
The race is on to get a COVID-19 vaccine to South Africa.
So when is government securing a COVID-19 vaccine? It's a question we're all asking, especially since other countries are already rolling it out.
Government is yet to secure supplies for the life-saving shots or made concrete plans despite an expected massive rise in COVID-19 cases.
South Africa is one of the countries set to receive the COVAX COVID-19 vaccine. It still remains unclear when the vaccine will be available in the country.
South Africa missed the deadline time to pay the deposit to secure COVAX vaccine supplies.
I think the government has dropped the ball. They don't have a plan for vaccines that will get us sufficient doses in good time.
The notion that South Africa can vaccinate 67% of its population by the end of 2021, unfortunately, that's, with all due respect, very naive.
This is an existential crisis for the country.
Just last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the nation announcing South Africa's vaccine plan, or the lack thereof. He had some deadlines that he set. He talked about 20 million doses of the vaccine. Let's take a look at what he said.
Our strategy has several parts to it. The first part of our strategy is to acquire enough vaccine doses to reach this population or herd immunity. We will receive vaccine doses for around 10% of our population through the COVAX facility. The South African government has also been engaging directly with several vaccine manufacturers for the past 6 months. Given the massive global demand for vaccines and the vastly greater purchasing power of wealthier countries, we're exploring all avenues to get as many vaccine doses as soon as possible. We have to date secured 20 million doses to be delivered mainly in the course of the year and substantial amount of it in the first half of the year. If we act with both urgency as well as purpose, we will be able to prevent more infections. We will be able to save more lives, to rebuild our economy, and ultimately overcome the disease.
I want us to truly unpack exactly what the president has said and the implications of this address, and obviously in terms of our vaccine rollout plan. This morning, I am joined in the studio by the Western Cape Premier, Alan Winde. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us.
So good to be here.
And I'm also joined by Geordin Hill-Lewis, who's our Shadow Minister for Finance. Thank you very much, Geordin, for coming.
Great to be here.
I'm also joined by Professor Alex van der Heever, who's an industry expert who will also be joining us online. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning.
Right. I want us to firstly just take a quick dive into exactly what the president has said. I mean, the president announced that they had been engaging with several manufacturers for the past 6 months. But this morning alone, there's breaking news from Pfizer that, in fact, government had been slow to start and had been gun shy with engaging with them this whole time. In fact, they had to repeatedly follow up with them. Now, the question is, has government been lying to us about the manufacturing, the engagements that they've had with manufacturers? And if so, or if not, then it's incumbent on the Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, to effectively come out and say, these are the manufacturers that they've been engaging with. This is the status of their engagements, and this is where they are. This is exactly why the DA on Monday has now launched a legal challenge against government on its entire vaccine plan, because ultimately there has been no clarity on what has been done thus far, what are the timelines of the vaccines, where are we sourcing them from, at what cost are we getting these vaccines? And as a result, government has been simply giving us vague platitudes like the president did, saying we will be getting 20 million vaccines here and there, but with no real commitment or concrete commitments. And now I want to get started on particularly the vaccine rollout and the timelines that have been put forward. The president has stated that we'll be getting 20 million doses of the vaccine sometime during this year. But government has made an audacious undertaking to vaccinate over 40 million South Africans by year end. Alex, I want to bring you in here. How realistic is government's entire vaccine rollout strategy and timeline?
Well, if we carry on going the way we have been, it would be very unrealistic. given that we don't have any commitments to doses at this stage, and that's a kind of, if we had sort of three elements to a vaccine strategy, one is accessing vaccines, the second is the rollout strategy, and the third would be making sure that people who are uncertain about taking vaccines are consistent, made, persuaded to take them. So of those three elements, we're still stuck at the first level. We don't have commitment beyond 1.5 million doses, and we don't really know when they will arrive and how they will be distributed. So that is really very problematic. So I think government has been caught napping. They haven't really done their job during 2020. And this has really put South Africa in a very difficult position. So the need to actually have an explicit rollout plan at this stage and explicit timelines and strategy is to make it absolutely clear what they're doing and what needs to happen next. The difficulty is many people are going to be compromised if we don't start immediately. But I think that we could achieve a great deal if we do start to move expeditiously. But at this stage, is a huge question mark over access to vaccine doses themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, Alex, we were told that the first 1 million doses would be arriving by the end of January. And it's now the 20th of January. So it's unclear still. I mean, it's absolutely unconscionable that government can get away with not telling us exactly when they're arriving. Provinces are still unclear about when they're getting their share. What share of the 1 million vaccines are they are to be expected?
Well, one of the things is that the target for phase one is healthcare workers, for instance, frontline healthcare workers. And frontline healthcare workers are on medical aid. So theoretically, medical aids would actually be paying for all of this. And the private health system would be very much part of the distribution, the rollout strategy. So what's very unclear is exactly how it would roll out. How would the vaccines get from the airport to the centres where the vaccines will be distributed? And then how will government ensure that the medical schemes pay for that? What is the payment mechanism? Who does it go to? That whole requirement is there because we shouldn't actually have that part of the vaccine strategy paid for out of the national budget. It should be paid for by medical schemes. But the mechanism is totally unclear.
Speaking of money, Geordin, I mean, a lot of people are saying, quite frankly, we're not a first world country. We can't expect government to simply roll out a vaccine like we've seen in the UK and the US. I mean, what's your view?
No, I just don't think that's accurate, Siv. Great to join you this morning. But South Africa is a middle-income country. Yes, we face financial crisis in our country because of years of waste and years of bailing out failing state companies. But the fact of the matter is, South Africa can easily afford this vaccine program. If we had a government that was on top of this, that had been planning this for months, that had been reprioritizing from other departments and cutting budgets here and there, finances is not the reason vaccines are not here today. The reason vaccines are not here today is because government has been sitting on its hands and has not been doing its job for the last 6 months.
So a number of people also, I mean, it's become quite evident that South Africa placed its entire all their eggs on the COVAX facility and have not started any of these bilateral engagements. And now Pfizer's come out to say that government actually hadn't been engaging with them as much as government had said they are. So, I mean, your view, I mean, the COVAX facility can only provide us so much.
It was absolutely clear from the very beginning that COVAX would only provide for 10%. So it's incredible, unbelievable actually, that the government put all its eggs into the COVAX basket and did nothing to plan for the other 90% of the country. And even then, COVAX, we still don't know when those doses will arrive. As Alex said, we're now on the 20th of January. We see other countries rolling out vaccines by the million, and here we sit with not a single dose in country. The other thing is, of course, if they had been planning and talking to other companies, they should have been sorting out the finances as well. What we did have in December, if you cast your mind back, it feels like a long time ago. What we did have in December was a 10.5 billion rand bailout for South African Airways. At precisely the time when we should have been devoting serious resources and finances to securing this vaccine, paying the deposits that needed to be paid, getting those doses here, our government was EFTing the money to SAA. That's what they were doing in December. And that is unforgivable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's criminal. Alex, some people have said, we meant to be budgeting between 8 to 12 billion rand for the vaccine rollout plan. Government has come out and said that they need about 20 billion rand, and which is related to a number of things, the rollout, the cold storage, all kinds of things. Your view on this price tag?
Yeah, I don't know where they're coming with the 20 billion rand number from. So certainly in the even at the top end, if we were buying all of our vaccine doses from the most expensive supplier, we would spend maybe 15 billion rand. So now we would never get it all from one supplier. So you'd expect a mix of prices and volumes. And so the lowest price we paid, it was AstraZeneca and COVAX, we'd pay about 7.1 billion. So we could probably expect to pay about 10 billion rand in total. So that leaves a sort of a big question mark over what they intend to spend the additional 10 billion rand on. And that really worries me, because there is immense scope within the vaccine strategy to direct funds for improper purposes. So the 20 billion rand price tag needs to actually be revealed exactly what analysis they've done to suggest that, because all the numbers show probably we should budget 10 billion in total for South Africa, and a large portion of that cost will actually be covered by the private sector and can be covered as donations by medical schemes, leaving government potentially with only about a third of the total price tag for their own book. And all of phase one should be paid for by medical schemes. So when you start to take that into account, I don't know where or why the government is supposed to be budgeting 20 billion rand and then increasing taxes to fund that. That doesn't make sense to me. So I think that you need to explain it.
Yeah. But gentlemen, this is the problem, right? And this is the problem why we have also viewed the fact that Parliament has been caught napping here, because ultimately government is accountable to Parliament as the national legislature. But we have not pushed government to be transparent about some of the costs, some of the logistics. And that's why we've resorted to approaching the courts to force government to come up with, because ultimately, I mean, here we are hearing that the price tag that has been slapped on this could be inflated. We can't do our jobs as members of Parliament if we don't see the numbers, if we don't see the plan, and if we don't insist on it. And so this is not the first time Parliament has been found wanting in terms of keeping the executive to account. But Ellen, I want to move on to you. You've come under fire this week for saying that the Western Cape, you are exploring going at it alone and securing a vaccine. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. When you're in government, you've been elected by the people of a province. You need to act in the interests or the best interests of the citizens of that province. And everything we do, we look through, or we have a lens that says, what are the risks? And quite frankly, the system that we've just been talking about, we don't even know. We're getting ready to roll out these vaccines. We don't even know what date they're going to arrive, where they're going to get to. We don't know that yet. That says to me, risk, risk, risk. So how do you mitigate that risk? Instead of having that single supply, you've got to look at further supply. And of course, we are committed. If we get a supply that comes through that single entry national government process, we've done our work on our side. This is what our rollout looks like. And it's complex. It's not easy. You've got to get it to every corner of your province, little villages, towns, spread out. You've got to make sure that you get the right vaccine to the right number of people, the right data. It's a complex process, but we're setting all of that up. But it can only succeed if we've got a supply of vaccine. So the risk says to me, open up that and find other suppliers. So that's exactly what I'm doing.
Ellen, I mean, we've met in Parliament with various provinces, about 4 of them already, including the Western Cape. And when we've asked them and quizzed them about whether or not they know how the 1 million is going to be divided amongst the provinces, when is it arriving? I mean, do you have any idea? Because we are in the dark.
So what we've done is we've gone out and we've said, right, we've already got the public health space. We know who the health care workers are. We know who our front line is. We're now engaging with private sector. So now we've built a database of these are the frontline health workers that would need to get that first rollout vaccine. This is where they are across the province. So we've got that plan in place. And then we have to, we will use this as a learning curve for the next tranche, which will be who are the next frontline workers, the next at risk that you would roll out to. Wherever you're getting these vaccines from, you need to have that system. You need to make sure that if you get your first dose, you're going to get your SMS that says your booking is in 28 days' time at 10 o'clock. You need to come and get your second dose. These are logistical, frameworks that have got to be put in place. You've got to make sure that you've got enough gloves and needles and staff and space. You've got to make sure you've got all that. So that's what we're doing on the one side. But of course, as you said in the beginning, the risk is where's it coming from? How much are we getting? And of course, we also spoke about the cost. At the end of the day, the cost is actually nothing compared to what it's costing society right now. The costs of death, the costs of the hospitalization and what we've all gone through as a nation, and then of course the cost to our economy and jobs. You can't equate the two. The cost of the vaccine is nothing compared to that.
Absolutely. And just for clarity for people who are viewing at home, obviously the province is also guided by the World Health Organization priority list. Even if the province gets its own vaccine or manage to secure a supply of the vaccine, we would still be guided by the priority.
Sure. The priority, we're also guided by SAHPRA. We've got to make sure it's an approved vaccine. So for me, I'm focusing on those companies who have got a global track record, that are already vaccinating in other parts of the world, and that we know will be probably in line to get that SAHPRA approval. Because it doesn't help the province procuring another 5 million doses and saying to South Africa, well, we can actually help with these doses, but it's going to take another 6 months to get the approval. We've got to bring, that's common sense. We've got to make sure we get the right vaccine.
Yeah.
So of course, for me, AstraZeneca is the first one I've got to focus on, but then of course the others. And so we're meeting with various suppliers for those main vaccines that we know are in the pipeline to come either through COVAX or come to South Africa.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to make a point, if I can add. So, imagine we had 9 provincial governments in South Africa fighting for their residents and looking to care for their residents like Alan is doing in the Western Cape. And it's just such a tragedy that we have 8 other provincial governments and a national government which is leaving South Africans vulnerable and afraid and alone at this critical time. I think that's really the real tragedy of this failure.
Exactly. And Alex, I want to bring you in here around the decentralization of the procurement process. So, Geordin speaks about, imagine if you had 8 other provincial governments that were also seeking to do the same. Surely it would mean that, we could be able to get access to this vaccine quicker if a lot more people were at it.
Yeah, so there's a question as to what the most appropriate role would be for central government. And if they were focusing on providing an enabling environment so that you can enable a strategy rather than try and control it from end to end, the approach that involves control from end to end is very often obstructive. It blocks out the possibility that you're going to have some actor at a different level of the system who will just get going and do stuff. So that's well known as a problem of the tension between centralization and decentralization. So we're already seeing the problems with excessive centralization. The fact that national government sat on its hands for most of 2020 instead of actually procuring and preparing for the vaccine rollout shows you very clearly the kind of problem that occurs if you're trying to control the entire process. So if it were an enabling framework, you would say, here is the overall strategic objectives. All parties that are part of the decentralized system comply with that strategic framework. But we will not disable you. We will not block you or stop you if you manage to procure or get in place. And that would not also obstruct national government from procuring as well and making additional vaccines available. So then all hands are on deck, as opposed to a few who probably are going to get it wrong.
And of course,
can I also maybe say that it goes against all basic principles of supply and demand, because we know right now, we were talking earlier before the show that the pricing right now is quite critical because the prices are quite high, but we know that there's sort of 10 companies that are going to get into this game fairly quickly. There are 160 busy doing trials, and so the next thing we're going to have probably by the middle of the year, let's say 30 different companies manufacturing. It's going to be, then we're going to see a whole lot of supply, the prices are going to come right down. And as long as those frameworks are in place and we've got the right mechanisms for testing and making sure we've got quality vaccine coming into the system, it's going to be way cheaper. The price is going to be absolutely negligible. And it's going to be, are those systems in place to make sure that the supply that's coming from around the world, we've got the best quality we can that gives us the best results at the best price as quickly as possible, so we can getting on with our work.
Yeah. And we can get on with rebuilding the country. Exactly. Because we know that our only hope really is to secure a vaccine in order for us to get back to some kind of normality. Alex, I mean, a lot of people think that if you're saying, diversify the procurement of the vaccine, you want to essentially say rich people can jump the queue and they can get the vaccine before anybody else. But I mean, we know that there's a guideline as to who gets it first and why and how. Do you want to perhaps expand on that?
Yeah, so I think that the question is, what problem are you trying to deal with through central control? So you want to ensure that your equity objectives are met. But a central government might actually be very inefficient at making sure that it can provide supply and also manage rollout. So those are two areas which central government isn't good at, actually, because they're too far away from delivery, both in the public and the private sector. So you essentially guide the process from an equity perspective, but you do not hold it back from a supply perspective. And I'd agree with Alan very, very clearly, we're going to face a glut of vaccines during the process of 2021. We will have many vaccines coming online. So this is the most supply-constrained moment. This is the period in which government should have prepared, central government should have prepared for. Because this is going to be the most difficult period and you want vaccines out as early as possible. So you want to plan for the period when supply was going to be most constrained. When the period comes when supply is a lot less constrained, you can actually step back and let the system run itself normally. And health systems are typically run on a decentralized basis. You don't run them from some central office in a capital city. Nobody does that. They are run close to the ground, and those systems need to be working. So enable that framework to get going, that the period in which they should have been on their mark has actually largely already passed. And so we now need to be preparing for a more regular rollout.
And really, the problem that government is trying to fix with a centralized procurement is not related to equity at all. Like I said, I mean, there is a clear guideline that frontline, you've got your healthcare workers, your frontline workers, then the next phase you go into your vulnerable people, and then the generalized population. So it doesn't mean just because you're diversifying who can procure the vaccine that, people can jump the queue and simply get a vaccine before anybody else. But, speaking about money, again, Geordin, I want to come back to you. Treasury this week, there was a front page news saying that Treasury is considering tax hikes for South Africa in order to fund this process. What's our view?
So this is frankly an outrageous suggestion. South African families have gone through such a terrible time in 2020. Tens of thousands have lost their businesses. Millions have lost their job, literally. 2.5 million have lost their job. So, they are facing incredible pressure. They do not need another tax hike right now. And another tax hike is not the way to get our economy growing. You don't tax an economy into growth. It doesn't work like that. We should be looking for how we can support those families and support those businesses right now, rather than squeezing them further to death. So I really think it's on principle wrong. It's morally wrong. It's also bad economics. It's not going to help the economy grow, and it's not necessary. We don't need a tax hike to fund this. We've spoken about SAA already. We haven't spoken about Eskom and the Post Office and the Land Bank and Transnet and every other state-owned entity that gets bailout after bailout. The billions spent on bodyguards and blue light brigades. There is so much waste in our national budget that could easily be reprioritized to pay for this vaccine, which, as Alex and I have said, is a relatively small amount comparatively. So we do not need a tax hike. And we, as the DA, will strongly oppose it because we believe, far from squeezing South African families more, we should be looking for every way to help them right now.
Yeah. I want to move on to the issue of the effectiveness of the vaccines. I think, a lot of people are reading up on it and they're a little bit concerned, Alan. You've got, 65% effectiveness, 95%, and a lot of people are anxious because primarily people are scared. They don't know what they are doing. And so we got a comment from our show, from Basi Muvango, who says, the question is, how effective are these vaccines? Do you want to elaborate on that?
I'm not a doctor, but of course I've got to know exactly what's going on here. I want to start off by saying that, we all get vaccines. We get, smallpox. We've sorted out things like smallpox and polio because of vaccines. Everyone gets a vaccine. When we travel, we get a yellow fever vaccine because we need to go to certain parts of the world. So vaccines are a part of our lives. It happens all the time. And then, of course, then you get other kinds of vaccines like the flu vaccine. So before we were even in the COVID space, vulnerable people were taking a flu vaccine. And of course, this is exactly what that is. It's about building up that immunity so that we can deal with getting on with our lives, rebuilding society. And so it's really important that we get to that herd immunity, number one. Number two, people are also saying that, in the system, we're rushing these vaccines in. And of course, all these companies that are doing their trials and have been doing that during 2020, it's been a race because we've got to get the world back up and running. And so all these companies have been doing their trials. And of course, in our country, we spoke earlier about SAPRA, they take that trial and they go and have a look at it and what were the implications. But I think right now, the biggest trial that's happening in the world is the vaccines that are rolling out. So I don't know what today's number is, but it's probably getting close to 50 million people have been vaccinated against COVID-19 already. And that's the biggest single trial going on right now. And of course, it is making massive changes in those countries. So they're already getting out of the blocks. And that's why it is so important that we get there as well. Understanding that, we are not going to give it to under 18s. We haven't got sufficient data on pregnant women. So pregnant women are not going to get the vaccine right now. But what we need to do is we need to get it. And, people, we need to trust it. And of course, there again, as a leader, I would be the one that says I need to stand back for that healthcare worker. But if it helps building confidence, I'll stand right in front of the queue to get that jab.
And get your first jab. Absolutely. Hopefully we can start to see that happen quite soon. We got another comment from Stella Mutlaung, who says, why are the calls for ivermectin falling on deaf ears? And I want to address this because I think it's quite important, because a lot of people have been saying there's been anecdotal and academic sort of reports which indicate that ivermectin could be, effective in dealing with COVID-19. The reality is that South Africa has a South African health product regulatory body, SAPRA, which is responsible for the regulating and essentially performing clinical trials on every single health product in the country. And so our view as the Democratic Alliance is that SAPRA has been looking at the anecdotal and academic reports which have been coming out from around the world from clinicians, and it's now high time that they come to Parliament, the body to which they are accountable to come and explain what clinical trials are they looking at and whether or not their position in stating that there is no real sufficient evidence which suggests that this drug can be effective in dealing with COVID-19 has now been revised. It's important that we are responsible as a political party and that we defer to our scientists, that we defer to the experts for them to be able to make this declaration so that we are not pushing something that we have not essentially been able to be privy to the clinical trials on. And I'm sure that's possibly the position that the Western Cape government is taking, Alan.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had many people sending much to us. The health department have sent it again. I personally have seen a number of the emails coming back from a number of the doctors and professors involved with SAPRA and listening to what they have to say. And in actual fact, making sure that we get that and other potential medicinal processes that can help us get through this. Because remember, we're talking about vaccines on the one side, It's a rollout. It's going to take time. We need to build herd immunity, but at the same time, we're probably going to have a third wave hit us. And, we won't have vaccinated everybody by the third wave. So we've got to make sure that we are bringing all of these various mechanisms together so that we actually get back to a new normal. So it's building immunity, getting the vaccines, other medicines, and we're getting them through as quickly as we can, like some of the previous ones that have happened, that people have started using them, finding them out that they work, go through the system, and then they get approved and they make a difference.
And we obviously want to make sure that doctors are also covered, by the regulatory body. So that's why SAPRA needs to come out and make a declaration and a pronouncement on this, so that they can also be assured whether or not they can use this in their practices. I want to talk about more the Western Cape rollout strategy around the vaccine, Alan. But before we do that, I want to thank Alex. Thank you so much for joining us on this segment. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And now let's just take a look at the DA at Work video. Talking about the Western Cape's rollout strategy, saying that it can be rolled out in your 3-phase approach, and we want to hear a little bit more about that. We've seen provinces and we've heard from Parliament how some of them are more prepared than others, and we want to hear exactly what the Western Cape is planning when we get those vaccines.
Okay, so obviously it's a complex process, as I said a little bit earlier, because you need to know who's going to get, where they are in the province, and then, of course, who gets first and second. So as we said earlier, of course, your healthcare workers and your frontline workers, so healthcare workers first, then who's the second wave frontline worker? And in those discussions, obviously it is teachers, it is law enforcement officials, it's people who are behind a counter offering services to customers in our municipalities, in all of our offices that are offering services to citizens. But then, of course, it's also, and you've got to put almost a risk lens over as well. So I always say bus drivers and taxi drivers, they come into contact moving citizens around our region, and surely they are frontline, and so they need to be in that mix. Then, of course, even if someone is traveling in a taxi versus someone traveling in a car, the taxi is obviously higher at risk. So we really need to. And then now I'm breaking it down into like the third phase, which is granular. And how do we get that right? How do we know who's who? And of course, so what we're doing is we're trying to build that database. We've consulted with the IEC because they obviously have a database of citizens across the province. How do we use that as a start? We've got our own medical data. We've got 17 million customer records digitized and in our system of our health system. So how do we overlay that? Our municipalities have got data of ratepayers and electricity users, etc., so that we eventually end up with this database that we can then use and then overlay that strategy of who gets first. And then, of course, there's another side to it, and that is depending on what vaccine it is. That also adds a different, because some vaccines have different cold chains, and you also don't want to be in a remote place where you open a vial that can give 10 vaccinations and you only got 3 people that need to get, because you don't want to waste either. So I think that sort of contextualizes the complexity of what we're dealing with. And then, of course, you must overlay the ethics. And so we've got an ethics committee that's been set up to kind of overlay what we're putting in place and challenge us on it. And it's complex, and I'm quite excited with what we've seen so far. I mean, at the end of the day, what I want to see is a slick rollout that our citizens get the best system. I don't want to have long queues of people waiting. So we've got to understand those risks, and I think we're also learning from other parts of the world. What went wrong somewhere else? Well, let's make sure it doesn't. We don't want to make the same mistake. And so these are the complexities, and that's what we almost every day there are meetings taking place on refining it. And of course, now we're getting to that stage. Well, let's run the first trials, which are healthcare workers.
Yeah, but you see, that also just underscores the importance of actual planning and having a detailed plan, because it's not just a matter of just getting vials and just jabbing people.
Correct.
And then, yesterday, finally, you had, made an announcement that you think it's now time that the Western Cape gradually opens its economy. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think about the few days before New Year, where we were, as a province, where the Geordin route was in their peak. We could see the rest of the province coming into a peak. We had the news that this was a different strain, that there was going to be more infectious. So we at that stage were saying, hey, what do we need to slow down? How do we need to manage this? And we were actually putting forward certain restrictions that need to be put in place so that we can protect our healthcare system and get people through the curve. Now I look at the indicators. So what is the growth rate or the negative growth rate in infections? And I look at it by town across our province, and every single one of them have got negative growth bar 2. One is on 0, and the other one has got a 15% increase, but it's really up in the West Coast, very small town, and it went from 60 odd infections to 63 infections.
Okay.
So it's a very small number. But every single other town has got minus 25, minus 30. Then the real indicators are hospitals, oxygen use, the test positivity rate. Our test positivity rate for the last 2 weeks has continued coming down. The R rate, our R rate now is below 1.
Okay.
So all of those indicators are showing us our oxygen use. I mean, that's the perfect indicator.
Yeah.
How much oxygen are you using per day? And all of those indicators are showing that even despite now businesses opening up, etc., it hasn't had an impact. It is still coming down nicely. Obviously in different areas. Geordin route way earlier than other parts, then followed by Overberg and the city itself. West Coast last to start to see the slowing, but we definitely now have got to find that balance. It's not about swinging the pendulum all the other way, because we've got a risk of a third wave, and we need to actually build a new normal for the rest of this year. We can't have blanket blunt lockdowns and open ups and lockdowns. So we are suggesting now that we don't take the curfew all the way back to midnight. We take it back to 11 o'clock. We enable alcohol sales. We've said off and on. So off, go back to 4 days. Keep it out of your risk weekends. Your on consumption, using the curfew as a tool. Definitely this. I mean, the beaches and the coastal economies are decimated, and we have to get this open. And so, yeah, we're advocating. I've sent this off again to Minister Mkhize. We'll be pushing now for the next Command Council and the President's engagement. We now need to get that balance right. I call it the second pandemic, and the second pandemic is one of hunger and poverty.
Absolutely.
And we've seen so many jobs decimated. It really hurts me, and so we've got to get that balance right.
Yeah, Geordin.
Yeah, I think Alan's given a very comprehensive answer, but when I just see these thousands of businesses closing down, more notices every day of restaurants and tourism businesses and businesses related to the liquor industry, taverns and so on, shutting their doors, and these wonderful entrepreneurs, which are our biggest national asset as a country, struggling and having to close these businesses that they've sweated over and built over years. It is really a national tragedy and a second pandemic, as Alan says. So I would really advocate for reopening the economy, letting these businesses get back to some degree of normalcy. As Alan says, it will not be normal for a long time. But if they can just get enough revenue through the door to keep open, to survive this period so that they can thrive again at some later point, then we would do the country a massive favor. And as I said to you on our last show, Siv, bankruptcy, stress, shutting businesses, losing jobs also has a profound cost for our country. And it's that cost that we've also got to keep front of mind in this pandemic.
Absolutely, and that's why I think, colleagues, it's very important that we are emphasizing the need for transparency when it comes to the vaccine acquisition, for vaccine rollout plans. I think we need to not take our foot off the pedal here. I think government has shown that we've missed deadlines where it has been necessary. We have not provided concrete plans when it has been necessary, and that is why the DA has essentially launched a legal action against the South African government, because our view is that the president now has 7 days until Monday to be able to provide a concrete plan. If we have a plan, then the president must share it. Then the president and the Minister of Health must share their plan on exactly how it is that we're going to acquire the vaccine, pay for the vaccine, and distribute for the vaccine, particularly targeting our frontline workers. And if they fail to do so, we will be approaching the courts. There's precedent for such a thing. The TAC back in 2002 took the Department of Health to court to compel them with the rollout of the ARVs. We rely on that same precedent, and we will not hesitate to pursue this matter through the courts. Thank you so much, Alan and Jordan, for joining me, and hopefully next time.
Yep,
cool. Thanks, sir.
Happy New Year, everyone.
And that's a wrap, Mzansi Africa. While things may feel incredibly difficult so early in the year, it is important that we don't lose hope. As the world grapples with this pandemic, it is important that as South Africans, we unite and we look after one another. Our country has a history of overcoming the worst, and we can overcome this too. We will be here to guide you through what you need to know, giving you reliable information, and helping steer South Africa safely through all of this. Let's live in hope and not in fear. See you next week. Keep it tight, Mzansi.